Good day and welcome to the November 2023 briefing. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Chair Rochelle Garza. Please go ahead.
Good morning. This briefing of the United States Commission on Civil Rights comes to order at 9:08 a.m. on November the 17th of 2023, and it takes place at the Commission headquarters at 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C. 20425. Good morning, everyone. I'm the chair of the Commission. My name is Rochelle M. Garza. Joining me today in person for this briefing are Vice Chair Nurse, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Jones, and Commissioner Magpie. On the phone, if you can confirm you are present after I say your name, I believe we have Commissioner Adams, Commissioner Gilchrist, Commissioner Kirsnell.
I am present.
Good morning, Commissioner Gilchrist. Commissioner Kirsnell?
Here.
Good morning. Will the court reporter confirm for the record that you are present? Good. Mr. Staff Director, will you confirm for the record that you are present?
I am present.
Great. I welcome everyone to our briefing entitled Racial Disparities in Violent Crime Victimization in the United States. Prior to commencing this hearing, I must address the nationwide rise that we have seen in reports of hate crimes and harassment, especially the alarming spike in disturbing incidents and threats to Jewish, Israeli, Muslim, Arab, and Palestinians in the United States. All of these communities have a history of marginalization and scapegoating that we must never forget. The Commission has a long history of denouncing hate crimes that occur in this country. For example, our work on hate crimes, anti-Semitism on campus, Islamophobia after 9/11, and our recent report on anti-Asian hate after the pandemic all denounce bias and hate-motivated acts of violence. This commission stands for equal, fair, and safe treatment for all people, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, age, disability, or national origin. And today's briefing is absolutely no different. In today's briefing, the Commission seeks to gain an understanding about how the U.S. Department of Justice uses tools such as gathering data on victims of violent crimes to perform their duty enforcing the U.S. Constitution and federal civil rights law. We will examine the following: what data indicates regarding increases in crime affecting minority communities, whether there are gaps in data or other research regarding race and national origin in the jurisdiction of the DOJ, and review what responses the federal, state, and local agencies have made in recent years, aligned or not aligned to the research that has been conducted by the DOJ into racial, ethnic, and gender disparities between groups of crime victims in the United States. Today, we're going to hear testimony from nearly 24 speakers that encompass former government officials, law enforcement, community representatives, and individuals that have been impacted by violent crimes, as we seek to garner an understanding of the current trend in violent crime rates affecting minority communities. Specifically, we're going to hear from Panel 1, which will include current and former government officials. Panel 2 will include community stakeholders and victim advocates. Panel 3 will include individuals impacted by crimes. Panel 4 will include researchers and policy experts. And the day will conclude with an open public comment session during which the Commission will hear from members of the public who wish to present additional information for our consideration. So I'd like to thank all of the individuals who joined us today to focus on this critical topic. Your testimony will help us fulfill our mission to be the nation's eyes and ears on civil rights. I would like to thank our staff that has diligently worked on preparing this briefing report. I'd like to thank Merrick Xavier Breyer, Bridget Brew, Julie Greco from our Office of Civil Rights Evaluation. I would also like to thank our staff for the logistical preparation of this briefing. I know how much work goes into setting this up, so I appreciate that. Pamela Dunson, Essence Perry, Julia Nelson Saunders, you all are doing the majority of the work. I appreciate that. I will now turn over the floor to my Republican colleague, Commissioner Harriet, who will give an opening opening statement or remarks on behalf of Republican Commissioner Adams, who spearheaded this project, but unfortunately is not here with us today. Commissioner Harriet?
Thank you, Chair Garza. The most fundamental duty of any government is to ensure that citizens are able to live peaceably, free from violence and coercion. Sure, governments build roads and deliver the mail too, and that's nice. And in the modern world, they even try to tell us what sort of shower heads we should be using. But in the end, the most important function is to keep violence and coercion at bay for all Americans, not just for favored groups. In the Jim Crow South, one of the most severe problems faced by African American communities was that many law enforcement officers just didn't give a damn. Especially when it came to black-on-black crime, it didn't interest them. Swedish sociologist and Nobel laureate Gunnar Myrdal exposed their neglect in his influential 1944 book about race relations in America entitled An American Dilemma. But not a lot was done about it in Myrdal's time. As crime rose to unacceptable levels in the 1970s through early 90s, Congressman Charles Rangel, with the full support of the Black Caucus, which he chaired in the mid-1970s, pointed out that the black community was disproportionately victimized by crime. He pushed for stricter controls on drugs and greater police protection in African American neighborhoods, and eventually his view prevailed. Law enforcement agencies began to take crime in minority neighborhoods as seriously as they take crime in white neighborhoods. When law-abiding people don't need to be constantly worrying about crime, they can spend their time achieving their own personal goals. Instead of staying home after dark, they can take a course in accounting at a local community college. Instead of spending money on bars to put on their windows, they can spend it on starting a business. Whole neighborhoods can blossom. People feel more comfortable coming out at night, and once they come out, their presence reduces crime all the more. Businesses are formed, restaurants, stores, and hair salons. Alas, in the last several years, we've been moving a bit backwards on this issue, and as a result, violent crime has risen. For example, as of October 28th, in Washington, D.C., there have been 821 carjackings in the year 2023. That's more than double the number from last year. Neighborhoods are suffering. And while we cannot bring crime down to zero without creating a police state that I think almost nobody wants, we can do a lot better than we've been doing. I guess every generation needs to learn the lesson anew. Defunding the police was not the solution to our race-related problems. And when federal, state, and local governments pass laws with tough-on-crime names, but contents that are anything but, we are worse off. More crime means more victims. The commission had a tough time agreeing to hold this briefing, but I'm glad that we are now here and ready to go. I very much look forward to hearing from the witnesses today. And so I think with no further ado, let me turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Harriet. I now turn to Vice Chair Nurse to give some remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair Garza. Slogans fly while crime is discussed in America. I know this from having worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1990 for then Senator Biden on the 1994 crime bill. Since 1990, crime has dropped precipitously if you look at the FBI's website. That's the good news. But in other terms, we are in the same sorry state we were then. In my experience, too many people refuse to listen to things that they don't already believe. Some do not want to hear that we are awash in guns and little children must be drilled on how to resist a mass shooter. Some do not want to hear that police officers are working-class people who are trying to do good. Some do not want to hear that the very people who distrust the police the most are the ones who need the most protection. The only way to solve this is to think beyond the slogans and to say all of the above. We need to do all of this. And the victims who will testify today deserve our highest appreciation and deference. In their honor, we must move beyond the glib and trite to consider explanations that are not what we assume or might want to hear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Chair Nurse. I'm now going to turn us to beginning our briefing with a few housekeeping matters. During the course of the testimony and the question-answer period, I caution all speakers, including our commissioners, to refrain from speaking over each other for ease of transcription and to allow for sign language translation. I'd ask that we allow for individuals who might need to view the sign language translation to sit in the seats with a clear view. We have Patty Painski, and it is a licensed clinical social worker with the Executive Office for the United States Employee Assistance Program. She is here because of her clinical expertise and extensive experience in the field of trauma. We have asked her to be here with us today to support us through these important but difficult conversations. She will be available if you need assistance. So please let a staff member know that you would like to speak with her, and our staff will direct you to the appropriate place. As I mentioned before, after the 4 panels and an afternoon break, we will reconvene at 4:25 p.m. for a public comment period. If you are interested in participating in the public comment period, during which each person will have up to 5 minutes to speak, we will be honored to hear from you. Spots at the public comment period are allotted on a first-come, first-served basis. So if you did not already sign up for a spot online, you may sign up at the registration desk now. The spots will be available until filled. If you are one of the individuals who signed up online, please check in at the front desk so we can hold your spot. For any member of the public who would like to submit materials for our review, our public record will remain open until December 15th of this year. Materials can be submitted by mail to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Office of Civil Rights Evaluation, 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C., 20425, or by email. The email address is victims, plural, of crimes at usccr.gov. So victims of crimes at usccr.gov. During the briefing, each panelist will have 7 minutes to speak. After each panel presentation, commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions within the allotted period of time. I will recognize commissioners who wish to speak. I will strictly enforce the time allotments given to each panelist to present his or her statement. And unless we did not receive your testimony until today, you may assume that we have read your testimony. So if you can summarize it, we will appreciate that so you can make the best use of the 7 minutes that you have been allotted. So please focus your remarks on the topic of our briefing. And I ask my fellow commissioners to be cognizant of the interest of each commissioner to ask questions. Please be brief in asking your questions so we can move quickly and efficiently through today's schedule. I will step in to move things along if necessary. Panelists, please notice the system of warning lights that we have set up in front of you. When the light turns from green to yellow, that means you have 2 minutes. 2 minutes remain. When the light turns red, panelists should conclude your statements so you do not risk me cutting you off mid-sentence. My fellow commissioners and I will do our part and keep our questions and comments concise. And now we turn to our first panel, current and former government officials. And I'm going to introduce our speakers for the panel in the order in which they will speak. We have with us today Alex R. Piquero, University of Miami, former BJS director. Welcome, good morning. Thomas Hogan, former federal prosecutor and district attorney in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Adam Gelb, president and CEO, Council on Criminal Justice. James Mercy, director, Division of Violence Prevention, CDC. Paul Pazin, retired police chief, Denver. And Steve J. Mulroy, district attorney for Shelby County, Tennessee, former federal prosecutor. I'm going to now ask each of the speakers to raise your right hand to be sworn in. Will you swear and confirm that the information that you are about to provide to us is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief? Thank you all so much. Dr. Piquero, you can begin.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Alex Piquero. I'm a professor of sociology and criminology and distinguished scholar of arts and sciences at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida. I also previously served as the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and the first Hispanic ever to do so, whose mission is to collect, analyze, and disseminate all data on crime and justice issues. I'll focus my remarks today on data related to racial and ethnic disparities among victims of violent crime as well as issues surrounding disaggregated data. Let me begin by stating unequivocally that the federal government plays a fundamental role in addressing civil rights issues within criminal justice. In order to document and address civil rights issues, there is a need for a complete disaggregated data. At present, however, there are significant gaps across local, state, and federal data concerning victims and offenders regarding violent crime and their demographics. Specifically at the federal level, there are two main data collection systems: the FBI's Arrest or Incident-Based Reporting System and the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey. They measure the same phenomenon, but in different ways. The FBI data focuses mainly on characteristics of the offender and the crime incident. All of you are very familiar with the FBI's change from summary reporting system to NIBRS. Those data came out last year, and the NIBRS estimates were estimates because we don't have complete information from all law enforcement agencies in the United States. In fact, it was less than two-thirds, or it was about two-thirds of all law enforcement reported in the first year. This year, those reports got better, but we're still lagging in federal data on all 18,000 some odd law enforcement agencies. The Bureau of Justice Statistics NCBS data, the Crime Victimization Survey, is actually a really nice complement to the FBI's data. The NCVS survey actually collects information on over 200,000 individuals from over 100,000 households. It asks about victimization experiences, demographic characteristics of both the victim and the perceived offender, as well as whether or not people reported their victimization and then sought services for their victimization. We can go into numbers should you want that information as well. One of the nice things about the NCVS is it has information on the race, ethnicity, and gender status of the individuals, something that you don't have at that level of detail in the FBI data collection. Right before I left BJS, I issued a report that's online that you can actually look at that looks at race and Hispanic origin differences in victimization since the early 2000s. First ever report that actually documented this information. I want to highlight three specific findings. First, as the Commissioner noted, we have seen a drop in victimization in the United States since the early 1990s. That changes at the local level for certain cities and for certain crime types, especially in the last 3 years. Second, during the last 5-year period, what we've seen with respect to the NCVS data on victimization is that when you look at across race, you don't find many differences. However, when you unpack race and ethnicity, you find significant differences, especially with respect to violent victimization, which is overwhelmingly non-white. Moreover, what you do find is that when whites are victimized, they're by white offenders. When blacks are victimized, they're by black offenders. And when Hispanics are victimized, they're typically by Hispanic offenders, showing that most victimization is intra, not interracial, a key point that you can only find through data in the NCBS. As well, throughout the first 6 months of 2023, as director of BJS, I was co-chair of an interagency working group that was called for in President Biden's Accountable Policing Executive Order. We were tasked with summarizing the knowledge about federal data with respect to policing. Where are the gaps in that? On May 25, 2023, 3 years to the date of the killing of George Floyd, we released our report to the President entitled Equity and Law Enforcement Data, Collection, Use, and Transparency. One of our central points centered on the need for disaggregated data of all forms within the criminal justice statistical system to include age, sex, gender orientation, race, ethnicity, immigration status, and so on. There remains a significant gap in our understanding of crime and victimization in the U.S., and the nation cannot move forward toward true equity and equality without such data. Absent significant improvements in data collection, reporting, and dissemination, policymakers, researchers, academics, practitioners, and the American public will not have the information they need to make evidence-informed decisions. Disaggregated data, transparent data, reporting and dissemination practices are a key part of building trust between the community and criminal justice actors and serve as a foundation to ensure that our justice system respects the dignity and rights of all persons and provides equal treatment to all. Before closing, I want to highlight two of my own studies that are relevant to the issues at hand that highlight the power of disaggregated data. In the first study, we looked at the imposition of fines on juvenile offenders in Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh, and what we found was that financial penalties were associated with higher recidivism and that non-whites were more likely to still owe costs and restitution upon case closing. And a second study we just published in Florida, which is really important because we were to look at Hispanic offenders as well, we found that Florida courts were more likely to assign fees to Black and Hispanic youth in disadvantaged areas. And they levied higher fees when they do, and that youth with court debt were more likely to have future system involvement. In particular, Black youth with restitution had a high recidivism likelihood. In short, monetary sanctions imposed on youth, for example, in the juvenile justice system has a potential deleterious impact on recidivism, and it varies by race and ethnicity. While significant challenges remain, I am confident that there is enough momentum and interest within and outside the federal government to improve the collection of data, especially as it pertains to key demographic information regarding offenders and victims and the locations of those victimizations. Data, especially disaggregated demographic data, is critical to informing policy and practice as we seek to drive down the violence that affects our communities, including here in the district. The American people deserve nothing less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Piquero. We'll now hear from Mr. Hogan, if you would proceed.
May it please the Commission. I have 3 simple points to make here today. People usually ask me to turn off the microphone, not turn it on. So the 3 simple points are, there is extreme racial disparity and homicide victimization in the United States, particularly in our cities. Second, it is so extreme that some young men in some of our most dangerous cities would be safer at war on the front line of combat than they are on their own streets. And the third point is that DOJ has the capacity and capability to start to fix these disparities right now. So my name's Tom Hogan. I am currently a law school professor, South Texas College of Law in Houston. In a prior life, I was a local prosecutor. I was a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice. One day I woke up and I was the elected district attorney in Chester County, Pennsylvania. When I wasn't in public service, I was at law firms, usually doing criminal defense. So I've looked at this from every side of the aisle. So I look at homicides because it's the one statistic, as Professor Piquero knows, that really is reliable all across the justice system. Every agency captures it, and we know that it is reliable, and a dead body catches a lot of notoriety. So it is a very reliable statistic, and the public pays attention to it because it's how they judge, are we safe in our cities? So my 3 main points now. I started with raw statistics. If I could get the first graph up. So I looked at 6 cities: Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Birmingham, St. Louis, and Baltimore. 6 cities across the United States. And what I looked at was their base rate of the homicide population of each race, and then the homicide victimization. And if you look at Chicago, this is very typical. Whites, 33.1% of the population, 8% of the homicide victims. Black, 29.2% of the population, 76% of the homicide victims. Hispanic, 28.7% of the population, 12.4% of the homicide victims. Asian, 6.8% of the population, 0.4% of the homicide victims. This is typical of every city I looked at. In every city, the white, Hispanic, and Asian population, the population was much greater than the homicide victim population. But for the black citizens, their homicide victimization rate was much higher than their base rate in the population. The worst city actually was Los Angeles, which actually has less than 10% of black residents, but they were at over 4 times the population rate in the homicides. Over 40% of the homicide victims in Los Angeles are black. Huge disparities. So some very good researchers in medicine and criminology looked at this in a common sense way. And if you could move to the next slide, and said, let's compare this to the risk of war. And what they found was in 2 of those cities I looked at, Philadelphia and Chicago, the young men in the 10 most dangerous zip codes in those cities would actually be safer in the front line of combat in war in Iraq or Afghanistan than they are in their own home streets. That is an outrage in the United States of America, that if a judge was looking to sentence a young man for a crime, he'd be safer sending him to war than back to his own home streets in Philadelphia or Chicago. So what can we do about this? Now, I know the federal government, the answer a lot of times is, well, it's a local problem. Local government will have to take care of it. But you know, I look back at this and I realized that back in the history of DOJ, at one time they played a very significant role in taking on these racial disparities and crime overall. The Department of Justice in the 1990s and early 2000s started with something called Operation Ceasefire and then morphed it into a large-scale operation across the nation called Project Safe Neighborhoods. It concentrated on what we call the power few, the 5% of violent offenders who cause over 50% of violent crime in the United States. And it gave them a carrot and stick approach. The carrot was, we'll give you training, we'll educate you, we'll give you vocational opportunities, we'll give you counseling. That's the carrot. The stick is, if you don't decide to go that way, then that 50% of violent crime you are causing, you're going to be incapacitated with long federal sentences. And it worked. Violent crime went down in every city where we applied these programs. And it worked best for our minority communities. They were the ones that saw the biggest drop in violent crime. So I got curious and said, what's DOJ up to now? And if I could see the next slide, please. I looked at DOJ's level of prosecutions over the last 10 years. What you see actually is a very steady downward trend. That spike in 2018 and 19, that's just immigration, all right? Take those out and you see a steady downward trend. By 2022, last year, DOJ is at its lowest level of prosecutions since 1998. They have abandoned our inner cities. They need to come back into play to protect our most disadvantaged communities. And they already have the blueprint. They have Operation Ceasefire and Project Safe Neighborhoods. And the good news is, since it only focuses on that 5% of violent offenders, it doesn't cause mass incarceration. Instead, what it causes is mass safety across the United States. Justice is what we're looking for here. We need to protect our most disadvantaged citizens. Right now, DOJ, according to this graph, has not only the capability, because they've done it before, but they have the capacity. They could move up their level of prosecutions by just 10,000 cases, take on the 100 most violent criminals in the 100 largest cities in the U.S., and everybody, but particularly our most disadvantaged citizens, would be much safer. So, the bad news, there are extreme racial disparities in homicide victimization across the United States. The good news, DOJ has the opportunity to fix this. They have the capacity and the capability right now to get to work and get back in the game protecting our most vulnerable citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hogan. We're now going to hear from Mr. Gelb. If you could please proceed.
Yes, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you this morning. I'm Adam Gelb, President, CEO, and founder of the Council on Criminal Justice, which is a nonpartisan think tank and invitational membership organization. If you're familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations, you can think of CCJ as sort of the criminal justice analog of CFR, except a good bit younger and way hipper. My job this morning is to put some of these crime trends and disparities with respect to violent victimization in context with how that plays out in the criminal justice system, particularly in imprisonment. And that's been a good bit of part of the focus of CCJ as we try to unpack this. I want to just note at the beginning, similar to what Mr. Hogan said here, that is really important to distinguish population-based disparities from behavior-based ones. Almost all public discussion of disparities revolves around the former and discounts the possibility of the latter. However, as you've just demonstrated, multiple data sources and homicide trends indicate that black individuals experience far higher levels of offending and victimization. And it's also important to note that scholars have concluded that this is not due to any type of inherent factor, but is largely explained by disproportionate exposure to a nexus of discriminatory historical, structural, and economic factors. So we've been working very intensely with two researchers at the Georgia State University, Bill Sable and Thaddeus Johnson, and other leading experts to try to understand the extent to which the criminal justice system might be mirroring or magnifying these disparities that occur in society and offending, and to work to advance understanding of why these disparities in the system have been declining over the past 20 years and to identify which policies and practices might further narrow the disparities in imprisonment. So I'm going to try quickly here to walk through three pieces. There's a fairly extensive written testimony. I'm not going to try to hit everything in here, but 3 of the 5 points in the written testimony about violent crime trends, disparity in imprisonment, and if I have time, a little bit of issues around what we know from data about police community trust. So first, I want to hit the crime trends, long-term and short-term. Professor Piquero explained to you the 2 different sources. If we could hit the next slide, please. You see here the first one that he mentioned, the Uniform Crime Reports here, and you see the huge rise from the 60s to the peak in 1991, and then the slide in reported crime to police, 50% lower in 22 than it was in 1991. And then if you move to the victimization slide, the next piece, you can see that reflected in the NCVS as well with that long slide. There's a bit of an anomaly. We shouldn't talk about it today, but a bit of anomaly here between the NCVS and the UCR for what happened in 2022 with the police reports showing a drop in violent crime and the victimization surveys showing an increase, and that's something that a number of people, including people at the department, are trying to figure out why there's more of a discrepancy that happened in this past year than there has been before. Now, if you switch to the next slide, if you see, those long-term drops in violence and other types of crime into context, you see here the work we've been doing at CCJ in the last few years to try to track what's happening in more real time by pulling samples of cities that provide data consistently in real time on their public portals. And the way to read this chart is to see that every one of these bars compares each year to 2019. So if you look at homicide, you see the rise in 2020 went up in this sample of about 3 dozen cities, 24%, and then in 2021, homicide was 40% higher than it was in 2019. And then you see for homicide and gun assaults, the peaking and then returning hopefully back to pre-pandemic levels. You see some property crime dropping, to put in context, as stores closed and people stayed at home, making it harder to burglarize homes. And then this real anomaly here with motor vehicle theft, which is spiking and continues to spike. If you hit the next slide, please. How does this play out in imprisonment disparity? We've been tracking over the past 20 years. This is broken out by offense, but note that the overall black-white imprisonment disparity has dropped from about 8.2 to 1 blacks to whites to 4.9 to 1, and that's largely mirrored in that trend line for violence, which has dropped from 8.3 to 6.2. Notice the huge slide in the drug imprisonment disparity. It's about a 75% reduction in the black-white imprisonment disparity. Next slide, please, will show that the narrowing of that disparity gap in imprisonment for violent crimes is a function of both a drop in the black rate and an increase in the white rate. So both things move there. We should hit the next slide, please. And why don't you pass that one as well so I can get through this. There are 2 parts, right, to the prison population, function of 2 things: how many people go in and how long they stay. So we've been unpacking this, and what we're finding is that if you look at the behavior-based rate here in terms of what is coming to the court system, that is new court commitments to prison per arrest, not a base population rate, you find that in terms of the system playing the hand that it's dealt versus looking at population rates, you see the narrowing almost to 1 to 1. And the way to read that chart is a disparity ratio of 1 is parity, 1 to 1, and a disparity ratio of 2 is 2 to 1. And you see some of these lines starting to get pretty close to 1, meaning parity, for how the courts are processing the cases that are coming into them in arrest. Let's hit the next slide, please. And when you look at the NCVS and the offending rates by race, and the offender accounts of who was the assailant in non-fatal violent cases, you actually have a situation that has occurred in the last few years where there's actually a reverse disparity occurring, where white people are more likely to be in prison for these offenses than would be predicted by their rate of offending in the community. So let me finish up by just concluding that we're not going to make a huge dent in the disparities in imprisonment until we reduce the rate of violent offending and the disparity in the rate of violent offending between the races, until we reduce the length of stay of prison terms, or until we make changes in the influence of criminal history on sentencing length. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gelb. We're going to now hear from Dr. Mercy.
Good morning, members of the Commission. My name is Jim Mercy. I'm Director of the Division of Violence Prevention at the nation's leading public health agency, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about CDC's efforts to better understand and reduce persistent racial and ethnic disparities in violence. CDC is committed to preventing violence-related injuries, deaths, and behaviors associated with all forms of violence. Sadly, while homicide, the most severe form of violence, has been the third leading cause of death among youth in the United States, it has been the leading cause of death among young black males 10 to 34 years of age for decades. My remarks will focus on, first, national data documenting racial and ethnic disparities in homicide and non-fatal assault injuries. Second, predominant drivers of these racial and ethnic disparities. And third, evidence-based approaches to reducing racial and ethnic disparities in violence. CDC monitors patterns and trends in violence-related deaths and non-fatal injuries using a range of data systems. These data systems provide a picture of the magnitude of victimization due to violence in the U.S. and its disproportionate impact on racial and ethnic minorities. In 2022, there were almost 25,000 homicides in the U.S. Homicide rates for black people were 10 times higher for American Indian and Alaskan Native people, 5 times higher, and for Hispanic people, twice as high as those for non-Hispanic white people. Most homicide victims are male and young. Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Hispanic males ages 10 to 34 are at greatest risk of dying from homicide, and their rates far exceed those for non-Hispanic white males in this age group. In 2022, 79% of all homicides were the result of firearm injuries. The firearm homicide rate increased nearly 35% between 2019 and 2020, and then increased 8% more in 2021, resulting in the highest rate since 1993. However, the recent increase in firearm homicides was not equally distributed among all populations. Young people, males, black people, and American Indian and Alaskan Natives experienced the largest increases in 2020. These increases resulted in the widening of long-standing racial and ethnic disparities in firearm homicide rates. Many people experience non-fatal injuries associated with violence. Approximately 1.5 million people are treated in U.S. emergency departments each year for injuries resulting from violence inflicted by others. Data from the National Hospital Ambulatory Medical Care Survey for 2019 through 2021 indicate that emergency department visit rate for assault injuries was 4.5 times as high for black, non-Hispanic people compared to white non-Hispanics. The same rate was 1.5 times as high for Hispanic people compared to white non-Hispanics. There are 3 features of these disparities worth noting. First, racial and ethnic disparities for violence are greater for the more serious violence outcomes. That is, disparities are greatest for homicide, followed by non-fatal injuries. Second, racial and ethnic disparities are greatest among male adolescents and young adults. And third, when rates of violence increase, racial and ethnic disparities in violence increase as well. I would like to point to some key factors that drive racial and ethnic disparities in violent victimization. Most central are neighborhood and community conditions such as poverty, access to quality education, employment opportunities, and affordable housing. These conditions are disproportionately experienced by racial and ethnic minority communities, and research consistently shows that they drive disparities in the risk for violence. The influence of these social determinants on violence can also be understood in terms of their impact on the likelihood that children and adolescents will experience trauma associated with adverse experiences, such as child maltreatment, or living with a parent who has substance abuse or mental health problems. Cumulative exposure to childhood adversity affects health and the probability of being a victim or engaging in violence. Over the past 40 years, much has been learned about preventing violence. A range of evidence-based policies, programs, and practices for addressing different types of violence can be found in a series of CDC publications called Resources for Action. I would like to share some examples of the evidence for preventing and reducing racial and ethnic disparities in violence from the perspective of, first, what can be done to address individuals at high risk; secondly, the locations where violence is most likely to occur; and thirdly, the social and structural conditions that contribute to violence. First, evidence-based approaches to addressing the needs of people at greatest risk for experiencing violence include, for example, street outreach programs. These programs help to interrupt conflict in communities and connect populations at highest risk of violence with services. Evaluations have shown promising results for multiple outcomes, including firearm violence. Also, when people are injured from violence, there can be a window of opportunity to provide help. Hospital-based programs can connect them and their families with services. Hospital-based programs have shown reductions in multiple violence-related outcomes. Second, we can improve the physical conditions within the community locations where violence is most likely to occur. For example, multiple cities have success with revitalizing vacant lots, also referred to as greening programs. This increases opportunities for positive social interactions and reduces the likelihood of violence and benefits those areas with the highest poverty. We can also make sure students arrive and get home safely to and from school. Chicago Safe Passage provides students with safe routes to and from school by placing community members along these routes to monitor and assist with student safe travel. Studies have shown benefits on school attendance, but also reductions in violent crime. Third, the evidence supports the underlying conditions that contribute to the risk of violence. We can help strengthen economic and household stability through approaches like housing assistance, child care subsidies, tax credits, and livable wages. These approaches can lift families out of poverty, reduce stress, and contribute to reductions in violence. We need new solutions. We need solutions not just informed by criminal justice, but also by public health. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mercy. Chief Pazin, if you could proceed.
Thank you. My name is Paul Pazin. I have the great pleasure of being the former police chief in Denver, Colorado. I served the city that I was born and raised for 28 years. It is an honor to be here to share a perspective from on the ground. I've been able to see this firsthand during my entire career. Very proud of the efforts that we have made in Denver. We have led the country and beyond with our alternative response, like the STAR program, continuum of crisis care, co-responders, outreach case coordinators to address mental health. We've also led the country in some of our approaches regarding non-fatal shootings. We have the highest clearance rate anywhere in the country on a non-fatal shooting, which is just as important as a fatal. The difference between a homicide and a non-fatal shooting is luck. And you can't continue the same old type of investigations on those cases, or else you're going to have future homicides. I'm proud of the fact that we have utilized evidence-based approaches from across the country. We had a PhD assigned to my office, and we also hired an academic to consult with us to identify what approaches work and what approaches don't work. We utilized ceasefire, Project Safe Neighborhoods, P&I, hotspot policing, anything and everything that is out there. What I can tell you is crime is on the rise. Despite law enforcement's utilization of these effective approaches, our homicide rate, particularly the disparities in our communities of color, matches that, as you've heard here. 84% of the murder victims in Denver are persons of color, and that does not match with the population of our city. I do want to address quickly the 90s crime spike that we have, because I've lived through that as a young police officer addressing it. We shouldn't use that benchmark and say that because we're below the 90s that things are fine. As a matter of fact, crime shouldn't be an issue in the United States at all when you start talking about the advances in technology, in science, in DNA, the proliferation of cameras, ring cameras, the city cameras that people have, the license plate readers that we have, the crime gun intelligence, being able to identify guns that are involved in cases, the lessons learned over the years on how to appropriately investigate these cases. Crime should not be a topic of conversation. We should have learned from the years and years of experience, as well as the new technology that has helped us. The criminal justice system is just that, a system. And oftentimes when we're talking about the crime issues, we point that finger right at law enforcement and say, why is crime up? Well, I can tell you, as somebody that has held the hand of a 20-year-old who lost his mother to gun violence, as somebody that continues to communicate with a brother who lost his sister to violence, that in too many cases, individuals are not being held accountable for violent and repeat offenses. Of the mother, 3 of the 4 perpetrators or offenders in this particular case were out on supervision. They had previous cases pending. So the police had actually done their job, but the other aspects of the criminal justice system are not keeping pace with that. Same with the brother who lost his sister. This individual was out on 3 violent offenses, all 3 involving a weapon, and was released on a PR bond, only to shoot a 32-year-old mother with a stolen AR-15. We have to look at what is working and what is not working, and that is all aspects of the criminal justice system. I did a report comparing Denver and Colorado Springs. Both departments have remarkably high clearance rates, 80% and 74% respectively for homicides. But what happens at that next level? And in the 4th Judicial District, Colorado Springs, that DA files cases 94.8% of the time and holds people accountable for the cases that are solved. In Denver, it's 35% of the time. And you can look similarly, Fresno and Oakland, Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, that when people are held at the cities that are doing well, there is accountability for violent and repeat offenders. I live in one of the most beautiful states in the entire country, Colorado. Unfortunately, because of many of the policy changes that we've made over the last 12 years, we're #1 in auto theft, and this is per 100,000 residents. This is crime rate, #1 in auto theft, #2 in property crimes, #4 in total crimes. We have the 4th worst recidivism rate anywhere in the country. And the people that are being harmed are the communities of color in our cities and in our state. Why? Why does it matter? We talked a lot about some of the drivers of crime. There's continuing research that points to trauma as being the greatest indicator of future violence when young people are exposed to violence, when they're victims of violence, or they see violence take place in their neighborhoods. There's a higher propensity or a highly likelihood that future violence will occur. So what is the answer? The answer is enough. You have to have enough police officers, which we don't in Denver, and many places across the country don't have enough. You have to have enough consequences, and you have to have enough support. And right now, Unfortunately, I do not believe that we have enough of any one of these areas that can help address crime in a fair and just manner. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chief Payson. We will now hear from our last panelist, Mr. Mulroy.
Good morning. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I have a diverse perspective on criminal justice racial disparities. I've been both a DOJ civil rights attorney and a federal prosecutor. I've done prosecution and defense. I've legislated on criminal justice and civil rights issues, which are the two areas that I published on and taught as a law professor. And now I'm the elected DA in Memphis and Shelby County, which unfortunately has an extremely high crime problem and also a lot of high-profile civil rights violations, including this year the tragic killing of Tyree Nichols. But sadly, Shelby County's situation is not unique. We are a slightly majority black county in population, but 90% black in homicide victims, and this echoes the national trend. DOJ data shows that despite the fact that our country is about 13% black in population, almost 50% of homicide victims are black. A recent National Academies Press study showed that both black and Native American residents are by far the most likely to be victimized by violent crime of any kind. And while some data suggests that the non-fatal racial disparity, non-fatal violence racial disparity has been narrowing, the murder disparity remains stubbornly high. Also stubbornly high, of course, are racial disparities as in the other end of the criminal justice system. So our slightly black majority county has 80% black defendants in our system. DOJ a few years back sued our juvenile justice system for discrimination, citing statistics showing that even if you were to control for criminal history and offense level, a black teen was 2 to 3 more times likely than a white teen counterpart to be arrested, detained, and transferred to adult court. There are, of course, any number of studies that show that persons of color are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and convicted. Persons of color are disproportionately both victims and defendants, so crime is a civil rights issue. It's not paradoxical to conclude that minority neighborhoods are both over-policed and under-policed. Racial profiling occurs for non-public safety-related minor offenses, but at the same time, those neighborhoods don't get the kind of intensive investigations and crime prevention strategies that the higher crime rates clearly would call for. Justice is, and that's of course the subject of a current DOJ pattern and practice investigation in Memphis. Justice is not paradoxical to say we need to do better for victims but also stop profiling. I don't think there's any inherent conflict between criminal justice reform and public safety, despite the claims of some who try to blame recent rises in crime on reform. In Memphis, our consistent crime solution for more than a decade has been to lock more people up and lock them up longer. It was manifestly a failure. We've had steadily rising violent crime rates throughout that period. In Tennessee as a whole, between 1991 and 2018, we doubled our prison population, a 68% rise in incarceration rate, making us 22% higher than the national average, with an accompanying significant increase in sentence lengths. And during that time, our crime level skyrocketed to well above the national average and stayed well above the national average, even during periods when the national crime rate dropped. And America as a whole, of course, mirrors this dynamic. You're familiar with the statistic. We're 5% of the population, 25% of the incarceration population globally, and we have the #1 homicide rate among developed countries. Comparing reform in traditional jurisdictions belies any notion that reform breeds crime. Per capita murder rates are 40% higher in red states than blue states. I know there are some that say, well, that really doesn't matter. The real problem is blue cities in red states, but that doesn't work either. Just last year, there was an article in The Economist, hardly a left-leaning publication, which said that the recent crime rates were really the same in reform DA jurisdictions and traditional DA jurisdictions. That Economist article cited a 2021 study by the George Mason University Antonin Scalia School of Law. Again, hardly a progressive, left-leaning, biased organization, as well as other studies as well. A study last year by the University of Toronto studied 65 cities and each individual county in Florida and California, comparing the reform jurisdictions to the non-reform jurisdictions, and came to a similar conclusion. One final data point I'll just throw out is that in the first dozen years of our century, New York and New Jersey saw crime rates fall faster than the national average, even as they reduced their prison population by a fourth, during a period of time in which the overall national prison incarceration rate rose by 10%. Time does not permit me to go through all the different data points that make this same point. And I am not trying to argue that reform jurisdictions are uniformly better performing in crime metrics. But what I am saying is that if you take a look at all of the data does not support the reform raises crime narrative. And I believe there's a plausible, intuitive explanation for these reams of data, one which might suggest a course of action on the racial disparities in crime victimization problem that we're talking about today. Minority communities, I think at least one of the panelists has already noted, minority communities, or perhaps it was a commissioner, need the most help from law enforcement, but at the same time are understandably the most skeptical of law enforcement fairness and the fairness of the criminal justice system as a whole. I believe that reforms can restore public confidence in those minority communities and in the public generally in the fairness of our criminal justice system, and thus incentivize those communities to cooperate more with law enforcement, providing tips, reporting crimes, serving as witnesses. In my view, this community cooperation is the single most important thing that we can do to bend the curve on crime, the most pressing civil rights issue of our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mulroy. At this point, we're going to open up for questions. We can start with the folks on the phone if there are any questions there. Okay, hearing none. Are there any questions here? Commissioner Nurse?
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you. That was incredibly informative and shows the range of really thoughtful, hard work that you've done, because this is a wicked problem. It resists simple solutions. And in my view, we have to start embracing what we just heard, which is that there are contradictions here. That going too far in any one direction is going to cause problems. So yes, under-policing and over-policing can exist simultaneously. So, you know, Chief Payson, I'm so happy to see you. My daughter went to college in Denver, and it's a safe city, but you must be frustrated. And I get that. I just wanted to ask you, you know, I worked on something called an assault weapons ban, and I know people like guns in the West. I have no problem with hunters, but I've never understood the idea that people should have an AR-15. And we are awash in guns. How much of a role do you think that has played in recent crime spikes, if you can just speak to it from your experience?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Denver historically has been a remarkably safe city. It was the 7th safest city in the country. That was in 2016. And we have fallen from that chart significantly, unfortunately. Last year, so 2022, we were the #1 city for auto theft per capita again. So relatively safe, but maybe your car's not that safe in Denver. Guns. I think all of us get in trouble when we start talking about guns and the Second Amendment. What I can tell you is it is a wicked problem, and it's just like we talked about trauma, right? A cycle. Something that I've never expected. Somebody that I grew up with high school just texted me in the last week wanting to purchase a gun and get training on firearms. And a couple of weeks before that, my neighbor came to me and, you know, well, where can I buy one and where can I get training on a firearm? People feel the need to purchase guns, people that never would have or never owned them in the past, because they don't feel safe. And if you don't feel safe, that is a failure of our government. That's civil rights as well, whether the freedom of individuals to be able to live without fear in their community is an aspect of this. And when you have people that have gone their entire lives opposing any type of firearm in the home, now reconsidering or thinking about it, you got a problem. And so when people buy guns like this, oftentimes they don't properly secure their guns, and these guns are stolen in burglaries, they're stolen in cars, or when they steal the whole car and the gun is left inside, now that gun ends up on the street. So it perpetuates this cycle. So really, from my perspective, the answer is addressing crime, reducing that fear of crime, and then you don't have these extremely high gun sales that often end up on the streets and in hands of people that are willing to do it. I'm so sorry to take up more time, but you know what panelist Hogan was talking about, there is a very small number of individuals who are willing to point a gun at somebody and pull a trigger. Fortunately, that number is very small. For us to be effective, we have to properly identify, investigate, adjudicate, and hold those individuals accountable, and that's how we can reduce the increases, the spikes that we've seen in murders and gun violence.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of you for the important testimony you have provided today. Those of you who have served or continue to serve in law enforcement, special thanks to you for helping to keep us all safe. I will just note before asking my question that Vice Chair Nurse's question was about AR-15s, assault weapons in particular, and Chief Pazin, you didn't address that. You talked about handguns. So let me ask Dr. Mercy. In your submitted testimony, you said that in 2022, 79% of all homicides were the result of firearm injuries, and the firearm homicide rate increased significantly in recent years, resulting in the highest rate since 1993. And you know that 1993 is a pretty significant date in modern times, especially because of the assault weapons ban. From 1994 to 2004, we saw the assault weapons ban considerably reduce the number of mass shootings in this country. And so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on the importance of an assault weapons ban at combating the scourge of this uniquely American epidemic of mass shootings in America from a public health perspective.
Well, as a government employee, I can't speak to the policy. I will say 1993 and that time period was also significant, and that was the middle of the crack epidemic as well. And there is some evidence that the assault ban had some influence, but it's difficult to be certain about all that. One thing about firearms in general, we know is that the involvement of firearm in an act of violence dramatically increases the likelihood of a severe outcome of a homicide. So the involvement of firearms really exacerbates the health impact of these events. So the more lethal a weapon that's used in an event, the more likely the outcome is to result in severe injury or death. You know, there's a lot of research that has been done that supports the idea, speaking to the issue of safety, that having a gun in the home actually increases your risk of household members' risk of homicide and suicide. And so I think that's another piece of information that people need to understand before they purchase a firearm, that it may not have the effect of protecting them, but actually increase their risk of very serious outcomes.
Mr. Gelb, it seemed like you wanted to say something as well in response to my question.
I probably shouldn't, but I will. I feel like there are two cross currents, speaking of holding two thoughts in your head at the same time. We have a lot of advocacy in this country right now around getting guns out of hands of people and trying to make sure that they're not being carried, especially the assault rifles. And we also have a lot of advocacy around saying people are unsafe in their communities, so of course they're carrying guns, and we shouldn't actually arrest them for carrying guns because we should actually understand why they're doing that. And it's a government failure that is causing that gun carrying, so we shouldn't fail them and then arrest them for having failed them for carrying guns. I don't know the solution, but I did just want to call attention to the fact that we have some fairly strong advocacy on both sides of this equation right now.
Mr. Mulroy, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, to the extent that we're talking about the need for people to carry guns for self-protection in high crime areas, whatever one thinks about that argument, that doesn't preclude the idea that there should be reasonable regulation of guns. And in our Tennessee, in my state, a few years ago, we passed permitless carry, so we don't even have safety regulations or any kind of precautions. And of course, you don't really need an AR-15 for self-defense in the neighborhood. And the whole Second Amendment premise of Justice Scalia in the Heller case was a right of self-defense, which doesn't necessarily extend to AR-15s. I just thought it'd be useful to add that for context.
Well, I'll ask my question after you. Commissioner Harriet, please.
I'd like to also thank all the panelists here. This has been very, very interesting. I think my question is probably for Mr. Hogan, because I think he probably came closest to what I was thinking of. One of the things that I have been hearing lately, including hearing from people here at the commission, is that all of this really isn't a civil rights issue, that we're talking about, racial disparities in crime victimization, but it's not really a civil rights issue. It's, much of it is within race, which seems odd to me. But, do you have any comment on that? Do you have any thoughts about this notion of this not being a civil rights issue?
I'm going to say, wow. The idea of it not being a civil rights issue because it might be a black man killing another black man, that sounds like something that Bull Connor might have said. I mean, that's a horrible sentiment. So, Jesse Jackson actually said back in the 90s, this is the #1 civil rights issue in the United States, and it's still true today. So, from a personal perspective, my response is, every homicide's a tragedy. Doesn't matter what color the victim is. Every homicide is a tragedy. That's someone's son, brother, father, uncle, and it's almost always men. From a statistical perspective, though, I think it's interesting to look at Jill Leovey's book, Ghettocide. Very good book, and it talks about, and this will certainly ring true for the other members of the panel who've worked in law enforcement. If you don't control every homicide and non-fatal shooting, you are buying more homicides and shootings because you are going to get into a retaliatory violence. If you don't solve that first homicide, the street keeps score. And if law enforcement can't take care of that homicide or take that non-fatal shooter off the street will. And then that one homicide turns into 2, and that 2 turns into 5, and that 5 turns into 10. And we're seeing that right now, because we're not taking that 5% of shooters off the streets who are really driving violent crime. So that sentiment really bothers me. It really worries me from both a personal and a statistical standpoint.
You've made me feel a little bit guilty. I've got that book Ghettocide on my bedside table, and I haven't read it yet. Maybe it's time that I do.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for your testimony today. I feel like there might be something underlying a lot of the testimony that we heard this morning, and that has to do with some of the social determinants of health that impact crime and poverty. I think the term was adverse childhood experience. I would like to hear more about those issues, right? How do we start looking at this issue from the perspective of protecting victims so that they don't become victims again, or commit crimes themselves. What are the opportunities that we have in order to provide victim services support? Because I know that that's something that is very lagging for individuals. So I just wanted to leave that question open to the floor, so whoever would like to begin answering that.
I can speak a little bit to that, Commissioner Garza. You know, there's a classic story in public health about people by a riverside, and they're enjoying themselves, and then they see people floating down the river, and they go in and they rescue them and take them out. Then more people come and they rescue them and take them out. Finally, somebody says, I'm going to run up and see why they're falling in the river, where it's coming from. So these issues that we're talking about, like exposure to adversity among children, adolescents, have upstream factors that are influencing them. Poverty, racism. And I think if we don't address those factors and really focus upstream, while we're giving the services needed to treat the trauma and that they experience, that ultimately we're not going to reduce the supply of victims and perpetrators of violence. That ultimately that's what we have to focus on. So I'll leave you with that, but I think both are important, providing those services that we have evidence-based services that can help people with trauma, but at the same time moving upstream to address the things that are really driving and causing this.
Yes, Dr. Piquero.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I've said in my own work that we can be smart on crime if we're smarter on people and smarter on places. My dad, who was a Cuban political refugee, came to the United States when he was a teenager, used to change oil in this big old 98, made 9 miles a gallon. And he used to do it with Quaker State. And some people may remember Quaker State, but they had this great slogan. And the slogan was, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. The absolute best thing we can do is invest in people and in communities when those people are small, when they're born, in the first few years of their life. Because you have a kid who's born today who might pick up a gun in 15 years. You have a kid who's 5 today who might pick up a gun in 10 years, and you have a 16-year-old kid who might have a gun right now. You have to do all of those things, not just one of those things. And too many people think there's just one little thing that's going to solve this problem. It's not. It's hard work, it's investment, and it takes leadership from the top of local law enforcement, local politicians, all the way up to the federal level. There's no easy solution, but there are solutions, and that's what we can't lose sight of.
Thank you. Mr. Mulroy?
Just very quickly on that note, one way of sort of operationalizing this that we're talking about in Shelby County is that, you know, in our juvenile court system, we have a dependency and neglect docket. Those are the people that, you know, they're coming from broken homes, and the parents are either abusive or neglectful. They have other types of problems. This is not a criminal docket, but about 70% of the kids in that docket end up in the delinquency docket. And then a large percentage of those end up in the serious delinquency docket, which means they will be transferred to adult court. So we have a pipeline there. And so the more that we can focus resources on those kids that are in the dependency and neglect docket, it's not only a humane thing, but it's a cost-effective thing, because it'll mean down the road we'll have less crime.
Mr. Hogan?
Commissioner Garza, thank you. First, we have to start early. By the time that when I was in law enforcement, I got hold of it, it was too late. We are not social workers when we are police officers, when we are prosecutors. That problem needs to be taken care of much earlier, when those folks are young, and that's when we need to focus on them. Dr. Piquero is exactly right. We've got to get in earlier and start addressing that issue. But I will give you this note of optimism. I believe in human agency, and out of all of these people who have enormous trauma and enormous disadvantages that they grow up with, 99.5% of them grow up to be great people, wonderful working people with great lives. So I believe that they can make those choices and succeed even past the problems that they have. And then we need to identify the folks that need our extra help early on as much as we can, because then the chief will agree with me here. If we could get rid of crime entirely in the United States, that would be what we're all shooting for. But it's going to take work across everybody in this panel and all of the commissioners, combining all of our skills at every level to do that.
Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate your comments. I've done a bit of criminal defense work and have worked with children in the past, and it's something that is very important to me. So I know that we have a question on the phone. Commissioner Gilchrist, we have your question is going to be the last question.
Madam Chair, thank you so much. I think the last panelist actually alluded to my question. What I wanted to dive into just a little bit was the relationship between both prosecution and law enforcement, and specifically since these folk are current government officials or former government officials. I was curious to know and get their perspective on the checks and balances in that process of seeking justice. And so if somebody wants to comment on that's perfectly fine. But I really thank them very much for this testimony today. It's very enlightening, and I certainly appreciate your willingness to testify.
Chief,
I'll jump in just real quickly on this. I think the last commissioner's point is something that we need to take action on moving forward. Right now, you could go to denvergov.org/police, and you can see everything that the police department is doing. You could look at the individual record of a police officer, previous use of force, anything that you want. It gets more opaque, it gets more murky the further up the criminal justice system that you go. In fact, our courts, if you try to evaluate how a particular courtroom is doing, the survey questions don't even indicate whether or not they are effective in their duties. It is how polite they were to folks coming in, do they treat their staff with respect, things of that nature. And it's like, if we want to find out what is working and what is not working, we need a holistic view of the entire criminal justice system. The police, we need fair and just police doing constitutional policing, making sure that people's rights aren't violated. You need prosecutors that are effective, courts, and corrections. When in Colorado, a 50% failure rate on recidivism for parolees, that's bad for the community. That's bad for the person that is re-entering the community. So we have to figure out the entire system, what's working, what's not working, and then work to get these issues fixed for the betterment of all people in our communities.
Mr. Hogan?
This is actually one of my favorite issues, so the question was a great one. If you want to look at the criminal justice outcomes just once it hits the criminal justice system, the equation that we always use is police times prosecutor times judge gives you your result. And if any of them go to zero, then the whole result is zero. So you really have to keep an eye on how they work together. And I'm sure the chief had seen that. If we look back through history, when judges were coming close to going to zero, you actually saw a combination of then Senator Joseph Biden and President Ronald Reagan passing the sentencing guidelines federally to make sure that judges would have a more consistent and less racially disparate outcomes. And it worked. It worked across the sentencing system. So we are starting to see some of that now. Unless you see consistent work by police, prosecutors, and judges, you are going to get racial disparities. And they are increasing once the federal sentencing guidelines stopped being mandatory. So that is something that we need to think about and something for the federal government to think about.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for your time, your testimony. It's very much appreciated, and we're going to be taking all of that under advisement. So we're going to take a brief break. We're going to break until 10:35, at which time we'll commence with the second panel. So thank you all so much.